rate measurements and echo measurements post-race, there's nearly always an increase in heart rate compared to rest. So we were interested, as were others, to see whether the sort of developing technology around cardiovascular assessment was going to tell us anything new about this phenomenon. And there are two real major developments in non-invasive imaging related to cardiovascular function. And the first one is something called tissue Doppler. I've shown you before the Doppler flow data. Tissue Doppler is simply the process by which you measure function, i.e. velocity of wall movement, by placing the Doppler sample volume over a wall rather than in the middle of the flow. The great thing about that is that you can move that sample volume anywhere in any portion of the cardiac wall, so you can get inferior, posterior, anterior, mitral annulus, mid-level, base level wall data. So it gives you regional function. And there is some suggestion that it is less preload dependent than the Doppler flow data. And the other one, which we'll spend a little bit more time on, is strain and strain rate measurement. Strain and strain rates are basically the deformation of the tissue, or the rate of deformation. We can do that using tissue Doppler imaging, or more appropriately, we think we can use it, look at it using 2D speckle tracking. And that again gives you regional function, but it also allows you to look at motion in multiple planes. So you can look at longitudinal contraction, you can look at radial contraction, you can look at rotation, which again gets into things like twist and torsion, which really represents the true nature of heart contraction and motion. So, just a little bit of data. The first time we used tissue Doppler was at the London Marathon in 2004. Just going to show you the diastolic data. This is early filling, this is atrial filling, this is the E to A ratio. I'm not going to show you the systolic data because nothing happened. Peak systolic tissue velocities were well maintained. The early diastolic filling data, irrespective of the site, wall site that you're measuring, E peak velocity is going down, A peak velocity is going up, and not surprisingly, therefore, your ratio of early to atrial tissue motion is going down as well. It was independent of indices of preload, was independent of small changes in heart rate, and it wasn't seemingly related to age, which we know affects diastolic function, or indeed completion time, which was our very rough surrogate of exercise intensity. So maybe there's something really quite consistent and intrinsic happening to diastolic function, even in something like a marathon race. Now, the next study comes from the Boston group, Melissa Wood's group. Tom Nealon was the first author, and they were the first people to look at strain in relation to marathon performance. No point in going into any great detail because it's not particularly clear on this slide, but this is a strain curve. So this relates to the amount of deformation in the tissue during systole. And you get about 20% deformation in the mid-septal region, i.e. that's what is happening from a contractile process. Post-race, it drops down to 16%. Now, in real terms, 4% change isn't a lot, but in relative terms, that's obviously around about 20% drop in contractility. Now, this, I guess, is interesting for us because it is showing systolic changes post-marathon if you look at local regional data. And we know that some of these newer techniques are much less influenced by things like tethering and translation. They also show diastolic changes. I'm not going to show that data for time reasons. And in a couple of cases, diastolic changes in this study persisted beyond the sort of normal 24-hour, 48 recovery period, and potentially up to 3-4 weeks. And they were one of the few studies that saw changes in function related to release of cardiac biomarkers, and we'll come back to that in a second. The one thing I would say is that they measured strain through the tissue Doppler technique. That's angle dependent. So really you can only look at longitudinal function. So we wanted to move on from that and use the speckle tracking approach. What we did, well, we went on a bit of a world tour like David. We'll get some Western States data in a second, but we also went to South Africa. If you want to go to a country where they have crazy people who run long distances, go to South Africa. We went to the Comrades Marathon. It's a 90k road race between Pietermaritzburg and Durban. We really didn't know much about it when we arrived. We thought 90k road race, a couple of hundred people. Well, there were 12,000 competitors and 11,000 of them finished. So it's a fantastic field-based study to go and work at. Now, again, not going to go into massive detail here, but this is strain-related data. This is peak strain, this is systolic strain rate, this is diastolic, peak early diastolic strain rate. This is radial motion. Okay, so this is moving towards the centre of the ventricle. Systolic strain down, systolic strain rate down, early diastolic strain rate down. Do the same thing with circumferential, you can see what's going on. Total strain down, systolic strain rate down, diastolic strain rate down. Go into the longitudinal motion, slightly smaller changes, but in most cases we're seeing the same nature of movement. So we've got regional and global changes in strain across all planes of motion. Now, hopefully this is going to work. No, it's not. Let me just go back one slide. Just keep your eyes on the upper image here, because it's going to come and go very, very quickly. But one of the things that was really interesting about this study is that we looked at a case study approach. And we took some people who finished very, very quickly and looked at their echoes pre and post race. So I'm going to show you a cross-sectional cut. And hopefully in the about 30 milliseconds that it's on the screen, you'll see a really nice ventricular function. There you go. Nice contractile function. All segments of the heart contracting together. The colour coding relates to the degree of strain. Now, this is probably going to go horribly wrong as well, but this is exactly the same person post-race. Anatomically, if we had the other cut, you'd see the papillary muscles, so we've got the same cut, and this is the cardiac function post-race. Okay, disappears off the screen. Now, clearly, this is the important information that you can take away. Here's the deformation of all of the 6 wall segments during contraction. The total strain is the same. The time course to peak strain and recovery is closely matched. That's a normal functioning left ventricle. Down here, you can see that the lines are now dispersed. Some segments up here are hitting exactly the same strain pre to post race. These wall segments here are decreased by about 60%. And those wall segments there, you might have caught it at these wall segments here, and that's the septum. And that's obviously the shared wall with the right ventricle. So, 2 things out of this. Clearly, functional data may be individually orientated from a case study perspective. It might also be quite heterogeneous depending upon where you're looking. And that's something that really hadn't been seen quantitatively before. Now, we were also interested in trying to determine whether this is an intrinsic or an extrinsic mechanism. Our first thought process is if it only happens in a portion of the wall and not in other portions, it can't be loading or heart rate related. Otherwise, it would affect all of the wall segments equally. And the second thing we did to try and determine whether it's intrinsic or not was we looked at the time delay between the electrical signal and the peak velocity of movement. So this is electromechanical delay. Anybody who does muscle physiology will know what electromechanical delay is in skeletal muscle. This is exactly the same thing. It's cardiac electromechanical delay. And basically, irrespective of whether it's the LV, the RV, whether it's in systole or diastole, peak Movement velocity is declining.